Thank you very much, Claire, and thanks to Dr. Downham and to Chris and to the Society for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'll just see if I can share my screen, and so you won't have to look at me, which is always a bonus. So we'll try new share and PowerPoint. Hopefully, you should be seeing my slideshow now. So I've started off with a title in the three làmh phailte. Well, that means the three most generous hands, which is comes from a comment made by Professor William Watson in 1918, the first person to really look at this poem in any sort of meaningful way, really. So I've called it this title, Gille-Chaluim Garbh of Raasay, in a 16th century poem from the Fernaig manuscript. But I think we should at least acknowledge that the scribe called this Gille-Chaluim Garbh, which you can see written up there in his own handwriting, a century after the poem was actually composed. So the poem's probably composed around 1575 or thereabouts, and this is actually written on paper a century later. More of that later. So that's one alternative title. However, I'm going to move the goalposts again, and what I want to do here is call this, just move the frames of reference a little bit, and call this All Utterly Barbarous Gille-Chaluim Garbh and a 16th century Gaelic poem from the Fernaig manuscript. So Gille-Chaluim Garbh, to give him his proper name then, Gille-Chaluim Garbh mac Alistair I Gille-Chaluim, was chief of the MacLeods of Raasay sometime between 1570 and 1616. He's a rather shadowy figure in the historical sources. He's referred to in English as Malcolm MacLeod, 3rd chief of Raasay. So he was part of the a broader umbrella clan called Gille-Chaluim, as they called them, as they referred to themselves, or the MacLeods of Lewis, as they're known in English. So this was one of the Hebridean kin groups identified by James VI in 1598 as all utterly barbarous. In other words, they were in need of rooting out, as they lacked any show of civility. So this comes from James's instructions on how to be a king, essentially, to his son. It's a sort of political manifesto, which was written around 1599, at very much the same time as plantation was proceeding in Lewis. So he doesn't mention Lewis by name here. You can see here from his Basilica Doran, this is from the 1603 edition. As for the Helans, there are two sorts of people. One that dwells in the mainland that are barbarous for the most part, yet mixed with some show of civility. In other words, they do what he'd say. And those that dwell in the Isles, these are all utterly barbarous without any sort of show of civility. For these, they had to be rooted out and colonies planted in their midst of answerable inland subject. By this he meant sort of pliable lowlanders, at least lowlanders who would do his will. So James was concerned with what he called, or he regarded as the extension of civility. This is looking perhaps to Irish examples where plantation had been in the vogue in the late 16th century under the Tudor regime. This, in a Scottish context, saw James wanting to extend civility and the control of the crown and those obedient to it into the Hebrides. So James's definition of civility probably involved Scots speaking, psalm singing, tax-paying fifers, rather than disobedient Lewis people. Gille-Chaluim, on the other hand, are the very epitome of barbarism. So the MacLeods and Lewis were duly expropriated. The lordship of Lewis was granted by the king to a consortium of nobles and merchants from Fife and Lewis, and the area was subject to lowland plantation from 1598. Now, so that's the area there, the lordship of Lewis. As you can see, it includes not only Lewis, but also Aonghas Garbh, Raasay as well as Fernaig in the north of Skye. In terms of lowland plantation, it really only proceeded in Lewis and Fernaig, and the Mackenzies tended to, the other parts of the Shieltorkil lordship tended to fall under the sway of the Clan Mackenzie. Now, James's agents demonstrated that civility, whatever the high-blown rhetoric, meant in practice for Lewis people that they were deprived of their lands. With those who resisted being killed or captured, captives faced civilized, royally sanctioned justice, leading in many cases to execution. The heads of executed Lewis rebels were sent southwards as a grisly demonstration of the progress of plantation. There are references in Lowland Chronicles, a couple of Lowland Chronicles, to heads and pokes. Despite this, native resistance to plantation, lowland plantation, continued, eventually causing the scheme to falter. After the failure of the lowland plantation by 1609, Gille-Chaluim's surviving clansmen or kinsmen in Lewis were absorbed into the growing landed interest of the Mackenzies of Kintail from the adjacent mainland on Ross. Yet Gille-Chaluim himself managed to survive. So although the Lewis branch of the MacLeods, the main branch, was extinguished in terms of the hierarchy, the MacLeods of Raasay survived as an entity, albeit now, after the Jacobean pacification of the Hebrides in 1609-10, Gille-Chaluim was now a vassal of the Clan Mackenzie, and we'll come back to that later on. So the fate of the MacLeods of Lewis, so the plantation, I should say, lasted in two phases: the lowland plantation between 1598 and 1602, and a second attempt between 1605 and 1607 before they finally gave up and sold up eventually to the Mackenzies of Kintail and Seaforth, who took over Lewis and retained the island until the mid-19th century. So that's been considered at length, the whole plantation episode, initially by the marvelous pioneering history of William Mackenzie in 1901, which based on primary source research, and still remains very serviceable, a really readable narrative history, and a plantation civility published in 2015, which has added to that and brought new evidence to bear on it. What Mackenzie's book didn't do was really consider Raasay, and I did consider Raasay in Plantation and Civility, but I completely missed this poem, and that's partly why I wanted to tackle this poem here today. So Shieltorkil then, the MacLeods of Lewis, who'd formerly been here and to which our poet belonged, were much maligned by lowland contemporaries, whose voices in Scots or English dominate surviving primary source material, most of which was generated by and for King James and his Privy Council. The impulse of the state to curb the Gaeltacht and inculcate civility is hardwired into the primary sources, and much scholarly writing on the Gaeltacht proceeds along these lines. A lot of discussion on the sort of the Gaeltacht, the Highlands and Islands in this period follows, I suppose, the lines of the Privy Council along inquiring around the statutes of Iona and things like that. So that sort of primary source material, I suppose, the bones of history, influences subsequent historical discourse. It's a commonplace that Highlanders were barbaric, or as the very king himself put it, King James himself, all utterly barbarous. So this has continued to influence history to this day then. So part of the reason for this, as well as the enduring power of the metropolitan perspective, is the really distorted nature of the source base. Only one roughly contemporary source survives in English from Shieltorkil, as the MacLeods of Lewis called themselves, meaning the seed or progeny of a Torkel, ancestral Torkel. So this account, written between 1626 and 1630, called The Evil Troubles of the Lewis, is published in Highland Papers, Volume 2, at the beginning of the 20th century. And it gives an internal clan perspective on their downfall. It's surprisingly critical, openly critical of the monarch. It states that in 1598 that Lewis was alleged to be at His Majesty's disposal, which is pretty strong stuff in Jacobean, or slightly just after post-Jacobean Scotland. There are no extant sources in Gaelic from the MacLeods of Lewis, the Lewis branch of Shield Torkel from this period. Yet the MacLeod of Raasay chief composed a brief, albeit only a 5-line poem towards the end of the 16th century, which gives us the sole Gaelic voice from the kindred in this period. And this is really why I'm kicking myself not to have included it in the book. So this paper then it'll consider the poem and its context, and then consider the career of Gille-Chaluim Garbh of Raasay himself. So Gille-Chaluim Garbh's poem was preserved in the làmh Scríbing Mhicrá, or the Fernaig manuscript. There are 2 volumes preserved in Glasgow University Library. So this was written in between 1688 and 1693. So 2 little notebooks, and it's composed in what one Irish scholar called a repellent orthography and style. That is, using an English orthography to write Gaelic. So if we look at a word such as scribig, S-K-R-I-J-W-I-G, which is the Gaelic word for writing, scribig, you can see that there's a K here, there's a J, there's a W, none of which appear in the Gaelic alphabet. So this gives you some idea of the difficulty in trying to decipher what Aonghas MacCoinnich or Duncan McCrae wrote in his book. So this was written by Aonghas MacCoinnich then, who was connected, so just to give you before I go on to the MacCoinnach's connection, this just to give you a sense of the scope of the manuscript, 59 poems in total. And it's from this kind of area here on the map, just adjacent to Raasay, just across the water on the mainland. So the scribe then, that's the scribe, Aonghas MacCoinnich, was connected by marriage through to Seonach Nicalister with Gille-Chaluim Garbh. So Seonach, the wife of the scribe, is a great-granddaughter of the poet, which probably explains the poems collection in this collection of verse. Seonach's 2 brothers had been lairds of Raasay in turn, but both died prematurely without issue. This left Seonach and her sister Sheilas as joint heiresses of the Raasay estate in 1688, the very time that the scribe started writing this compendium of poetry. So the 2 sisters then sold their right as heirs to a cousin who became the next laird of Raasay. The timing of Seonach's co-inheritance, contemporaneous with the composition of the manuscript, make it reasonable to suggest that this Aonghas MacCoinnach's interest in his wife's family's heritage and the poem by her great-grandfather might have been connected to this. However, I think he probably liked the poem as well. I think we can say that because MacCoinnich actually recycled the first line of the Raasay poem in one of his own compositions. So he's taking this poem from the 1570s, he's copying it into his Duanara or poem book, and he's actually using one of the lines and recycling it in his own poem. Now, many of these poems in MacCoinnach's manuscript haven't really been edited or translated or considered much by scholars. The reason for this is the orthography. But this one, this poem, there's the, before I move on to the next slide, is the sort of notice in retours of the service of Janet and her sister, Seanach and her sister Sheilas, or as she's called in Latin, Egidia, as heirs to the Raasay lordship. So the poem then itself, as it appears in the manuscript, is a very brief affair. So if commentators on poetry have overlooked it, they can be forgiven for doing so, perhaps, unlike me, who's supposed to have been concentrating on Shiel's Torkel. So this poem is, as we've said, presents a number of barriers. The first barrier really is the orthography. So there's a very reliable transcription made by Callum McFarlane in 1923 of the whole manuscript. But you can see, well, you'll see in a minute when we compare this with regular Gaelic orthography, what some of the challenges are. So you can see làmh, for example, L-A-U-H and L-A-M-H, and the different spelling systems. So this is creating a bit of Macras orthography creates a bit of uncertainty. This transcription comes from Professor Watson's Bardach Gaelic in 1918. And he gave it this title, which I adopted initially for the paper, Na trí làmh phailte, the three most generous hands. So he didn't translate it, he just presented it with some some glossary and some notes at the back for some of the more problematic verses. But I've kind of revisited this and come to some slightly different conclusions, but only really in the final verse. So the themes then considered here, if we just go through this, are I've given a rough translation here, which comes with a health warning. So a hul is during the warn, as Fernaig goir Gille-Chaluim in true phailte remore ni varon you've in a scale. Ha in neus en knop in aisle, làmh nach de Koning en tuil, a hit en làmh phailte dan facus de Glasgow Gael. Làmh eilje with Gillespie MacCoinnich hier nog, excuse me, she shouldn't darle làmh phailte dan facus de Glasgow Gael. Làmh jachin oig, ik jachin, maar Raasay via de gloeig, bishin en een làmh phailte dan facus de Glasgow Gael. Nish van geen truus en shachet, saun skun vinach gentuvig, ach iat maar geen boy a feuille, is robak miarstorst in tuil. So I only really differ substantially from what Professor Watson published in this. What I would say about this in the final verse, really. All of these verses talk about, in turn, various clan chiefs. This is who had just departed, and we'll come to that in a minute. But the final line here, or the penultimate line, is an interesting one. In the manuscript, it appears F-A-I-H-E. So is this phailte, which means thinking or soliciting alms, perhaps? Professor Watson read this as, and also McFarlane in 1923, as phailte yimich, which Watson glossed as meaning lobsters and burrows. Now this is possible, but this seems to me a very unusual image. It doesn't seem to be a good fit with the context of the poem. The poem's about generosity. So why are people squirreling away in, why are lobsters squirreling away in burrows? Advancing a slightly different interpretation, if we go for this yimbuai rather than yimich, which he translated as all lobsters. Jimbuai could be luckless or unfortunate. Jimbuai feuille. or alternatively, Mariam Bua Nefahia, the unfortunates in the fields. So that fits, I think, with the rest of the preceding verses, which are emphasizing generosity. So thigging, or if we might like to imagine if that's one of the solutions, is a practice where the more disadvantaged members of society, either thiggers or perhaps even unfortunates in the fields, solicited aid in the form of seed corn, livestock, or provisions from the better off. Lowland reformers, anxious to try and move Highland society along lowland market-orientated lines, tried from 1609 onwards to discourage thigging. They used to call it begging rather than thigging. Nevertheless, thigging, or phailte, persisted until the 19th century in Gaelic society. So if one accepts the alternative reading of Artiar, it would seem that Gille-Chaluim Garbh was praising the dead chiefs for their hospitality. So Innes and Cnocklin was identified by Watson as Innes MacDonald of Glengarry, Cnocklin the burial ground to Glachan in Lochalsh. Gillespie MacCoinnich would have been probably the 5th Earl of Argyll, and Aonghas MacCoinnich would have been the chief of Clan Maclean. We have obits for all of these chiefs. They all died between 1573 and 1575, giving a fairly good date for the poem, so around 1575. So the poem has attracted very little, my lights have gone off. The poem has attracted very little scholarly attention. W.J. Watson, as we've seen, looked at it. Alexander Nicholson, the author of The History of Skye, described it as an elegy recounting the transience of worldly things. The melancholy tone of the poem, looking back regretfully at the passing of great worthies, echoes the same type of genre which is also found in the Fernaig manuscript, number of other 17th century poems from Rossshire, which mourn the passing of clan worthies, with an older surviving poet remembering and rehearsing the virtues of the departed. According to Professor Derek Thompson, contrasting this sort of nobleman's verse with the sort of professional output of the professional Gaelic literati, calls this slightly different. He calls it sort of semi-bardic or semi-amateur practitioners of verse. So whoever this is the only example we have of this poet's work, these 5 verses. So this poet must have composed a greater number of lost songs. So who was the poet then? So Gille-Chaluim Garbh, first of Raasay, flourished in the later 16th century. And as we've seen, he would have been a slightly younger contemporary of these 3 great chiefs of the clan MacDonald of Glengarry, Campbell and Maclean. Oops, I've jumped a slide. So the internal evidence dates our poem then, Gille-Chaluim, as he was known, Gille-Chaluim Garbh, meaning rough or raw-boned, or something like that. Garbh is a nickname. And it seems to have been a sort of nickname that occurred over a couple of generations. A later member of the Raasay family would have the nickname Garbh as well. But this fellow, this individual poet, was so well known in his own day as Gille-Chaluim Garbh that he was known as Gille-Chaluim Garbh MacLeod de Raasay in a Great Seal Charter of 1572. And in 1572, Ruadhi MacLeod of Lewis, the chief, had no heirs, or at least no heirs he wanted to acknowledge. He had a son from his first marriage, who he cordially seems to have hated. So he overrode this son, Torquil Conanoch, and installed Gille-Chaluim Garbh, his cousin, as heir not only to Raasay but to the whole lordship of Lewis. Now, MacLeod of Lewis went on to marry again, and Gille-Chaluim Garbh fell out of the frame. But that's one of the first firm fixes on him in contemporary literature. In terms of his relationship with the three worthies that are noted in the poem, well, the reference to the Campbell chief is unsurprising. Gilles MacDowne was a major player on not just in a West Highland and Scottish context, but also in a British context, making really well connected in Ulster too. He was well connected with the MacLeans of Duard by marriage, both strongly into the Reformation as well. Two MacLeans, Ruadhi and Patrick, in the mid-16th century were bishops of the Isles, holding title to the kirklands of Raasay in the mid-16th century. So this all hints at a sort of network of influence which would place Gille-Chaluim Garbh in the orbit of a Clan MacLean and Clan Campbell chief. And the relationship between the bishops of the Isles and the lands of Raasay seems fairly strong too. As early as 1549, Donald Munro, Dean of the Isles, noted that Raasay pertained to Gille-Chaluim of Raasay by the sword, but the title to this lay with the bishops of the Isles. And at least in the middle of the 16th century, the MacLeans controlled the bishopric of the Isles. The reasons for Clan MacLean's involvement on the north-east coast of Skye are unclear, but this was the most northerly outpost in a sort of discontiguous or disjointed MacLean landholding portfolio that reached from Raasay and Scarpe, just to the south of Raasay, all the way south to Islay and Kintyre. So a powerful clan in the 16th century, although they were to fall rapidly in the following century. And they were also connected closely by marriage to the MacLeods of Lewis and also the MacLeods of Harris at this time. The nature of Gille-Chaluim Garbh with MacDonald of Glengarry, the third chief mentioned here, is more obscure, but they were neighbours and they must have known each other fairly well. But their deaths coming between 1574 and 75 must clearly have affected the poet. So in terms of the actual reconstructing something of the career and life of Gille-Chaluim Garbh, one of the earliest references to him is in 1568 or 1569. A traditional account is that he survived a sort of black supper organised by kinsmen in Delanyse, just by Vaternish, being spirited away by his foster parents, while a MacLeod kinsman who sought to secure the chiefship for himself organised a black supper. So he was recognised as chief of Raasay by 1572, as we've seen, and documents survive showing attempts by church authorities between 1574 and 80 to extract rents from a number of chiefs, and they name Gille-Chaluim Garbh of Raasay too. The next documentary fix on Gille-Chaluim is in 1593, when there was an estimate of strength by English intelligence. Basically, they were concerned about all these Hebrideans who might, and actually did, pour into Ulster to aid O'Donnell and O'Neill. So in 1593, it noted that Raasay was possessed by Gille-Chaluim of Raasay and will raise 80 men. And this probably drew on Gille-Chaluim's lands in Rona, Raasay, Torridon and Gairloch, as well as Rona, as Raasay itself. And he was, of course, connected to the MacLeods of Lewis, who could field around 700, it was thought, in English estimates for the wars in Ulster. Little else is known about Gille-Chaluim Garbh's life and career. In common with many of his contemporaries, he exploited the herring fishing boom in the late 16th century in the Minch, extracting levies from lowland boat crews. Hebridean chiefs, including Gille-Chaluim Garbh, thought that they could tax visiting fishermen, but the fishermen claimed that they were being subject to extortion. And the fishermen, taxpayers, unlike most Hebrideans at this point, had the backing of the lowland political and medical town community and the ear of the Privy Council. And this escalated this sort of agitation and on the part of aggrieved and I suppose the lowland fishing community who had been visiting the area to such an extent that they'd actually been setting up cocket stations or tax stations in Lochbroom in the 1560s, a real herring boom, and the MacLeods of Lewis were seen as being in the way. And by 1598, James, taking advantage of disunity in the MacLeods of Lewis, advocated plantation. So if we just scroll back just to 1587, 10 years earlier than that, King James had come of age in 1587, someone who was keen to exert more control over the Gaeltacht. And one of the first things he did when he came of age was to get a list of all the major landowners in the Gaeltacht, which is very useful for historians' point of view. So they're all named in a parliamentary roll, and the idea was to make them answerable for the behaviour of their followers. James's idea was to then target the chiefs and expropriate them if necessary. This is reiterated in 1594, and in 1596, a key date, James then insists on everyone needing to have a title. So once James and his cronies come knocking, if you don't have a title, you're in trouble, a landed title from the king. So that's kind of going on in the background. And to be fair to James, there was no shortage of disorder in the Gaeltacht. This is a era known in Gaelic as Líon Crach, or the age of forays, or the age of plunder. In terms of our information about Gille-Chaluim Garbh and his involvement in this crach, well, to be fair to Gille-Chaluim Garbh, it's a slightly legal, it's partly legal form of crach. So Gille-Chaluim Garbh, the Laird of Raasay, is named among the chiefs who were enlisted by the Earl of Sutherland to pursue the Earl of Caithness. So in other words, Sutherland is essentially using the colour of the law to pursue a grievance against Caithness. So this, the Earl of Sutherland executed this Crown Commission of Fire and Sword, it was called, against Caithness. The force wasted Caithness all the way up to the town of Wick. Although ostensibly pursuing the killers of Sutherland's kinsman, George Gordon, this raid gave Sutherland and his followers to take the opportunity to take from Caithness a great prey of cattle and goods. And I quote, a great prey of cattle and goods, or crachmór, with hundreds of Caithness people being killed in the process. Gille-Chaluim Garbh's son, Ian, is also mentioned in dispatches in his account from Robert Gordon of Sutherland, 1630. He disturbed the remains of the last Earl of Caithness. Finding a lead casket in the church in Wick, he opened it, but instead of treasure, he found a human heart. And, I quote, on perceiving what it was, he threw the same away, and the ashes were dispersed in the wind. So this episode in Caithness then was remembered as Lá na Creche Móra, that is the time of the Great Slaughter. So although a long-serving chief, Gille-Chaluim Garbh of Raasay, didn't come into his chiefship until, or didn't didn't actually get formal title until 1596. So this date is significant, and I'll come back to it again, 1596. Despite having secured title in 1596, he continued at feud with his neighbours, the Bains of Tullogh, over lands of Torridon. So Ian MacLeod, Gille-Chaluim Garbh's brother, had been fostered by the Bain family, and as a foster son had expected to receive the lands from his foster father, Donogh Bain of Tullogh. Bain of Tullogh, on the other hand, left these not to his foster son, but to a blood kinsman, his own younger son by blood. Ian MacLeod, Gille-Chaluim's son, then wasted the lands of Torridon as an expression of his disappointment. Ian MacLeod, not knowing that Bain of Logie, one of the Bains, had obtained a warrant for his arrest, attended the Candlemas market at Dingwall in 1597, where, while seated in a merchant's shop, Alexander Bain and his followers, and I quote, most basely killed him, striking him in the head with a two-handed sword, without giving him the least advertisement. So this comes from Robert Gordon of Sutherland in 1630. What I like about this wasn't that he seemed surprised about or offended about the death, being struck by a two-handed sword in the head, but that he did it without giving him the least advertisement. So probably if he'd given him a bit of notice, it'd have been fine. But what's interesting about this is that after the inevitable conflict that followed this, with parties taking the Bains and the Raasay people taking up arms, the Mackenzies took the side of the Raasay men. So Gille-Chaluim Garbh took revenge for his murder of his brother in the old-fashioned way by wasting the lands of the Bains in and around Torridon and elsewhere too. Bain, of fear of Logie, took legal action on 1599 against Gille-Chaluim Raasay of that ilk. If I just get this flag out of the way, there we are. Gille-Chaluim Raasay of that ilk, and Gille-Chaluim Raasay appearance thereof, and their followers. So what we see here is a fairly typical mangling of Gaelic names in Scots orthography, Scots spelling. But what's really interesting here too, and I've highlighted some things in bold, is that this Raasay chief, the Raasay chief, had followers not only from Raasay, but from Torridon and Gaelic as well. And possibly there are people from Trotternish in there too. So there's some disagreement about, so that's pretty much as we know of the specifics of his date, of his career. There's some disagreement about the date of Gille-Chaluim Garbh's death among scholars. It's thought that he died sometime between 1596 and 1616. That's according to Professor Watson. Well, we can narrow that down a little bit. He was still alive in 1605 when his son, another Gille-Chaluim, witnessed a document as Gille-Chaluim Younger of Raasay. Gille-Chaluim Garbh, and it must have been him rather than his son, resigned the lands of Ayr and Trotternish to Mackenzie on New Year's Day in 1608. But he must have been dead by 1610 when a Malcolm Mac Gille-Chaluim Garbh was granted lands, title to lands by a Mackenzie's superior. Well, the next thing to note then is the relationship with the Mackenzies. But there are two types of Mackenzies to think about here. There were the Mackenzies of Gaelic. Now, the Mackenzies of Gaelic had moved into two-thirds of the lands of Gaelic in 1494. The remaining third were held by the MacLeods, Shield Thorkel, who seem to have been closely connected with the MacLeods of Raasay. And we've got another branch of the Mackenzies. The main branch are the Mackenzies of Kintail, who we'll come to in a minute. So the Mackenzies of Gaelic then used this opportunity of the plantation of Lewis. Again, I quote Sir Robert Gordon, to invade the Clonmhaigh Gille-Chaluim with fire and sword and chase them right out of Gairloch. And in 1614, Mackenzie of Gairloch and his sons were given a backdated pardon or remission for crimes capital committed against broken men, vagabonds and limmers. So people like Shiel Torkel who'd been out with the protection of the law. The Mackenzies of Kintail, on the other hand, seem to have a different, a much different relationship with the MacLeods of Raasay. And it should be noted that the Mackenzies of Kintail and the Mackenzies of Gairloch had themselves a pretty fraught relationship. At least two of the Mackenzies of Gairloch died in mysterious circumstances in the bowels of Ellandonnan Castle in the mid-16th century. And as late as 1631, there's a note in a letter from Cullen Ruel, chief of the Mackenzies of Kintail, advising his brother to be wary of the Mackenzies of Gairloch. There was a bit of needle between both branches of the Mackenzies. But in terms of the Gille-Chaluim of Raasay, the Mackenzies of Gairloch were bad news, but the Mackenzies of Kintail seem to have had a much closer relationship. Gille-Chaluim Garbh was indeed married to one of the Mackenzie of Kintail family. And I think it's always implicit rather than explicitly stated, but the Mackenzies seem to have supported the MacLeods of Raasay in the feud with the Bains of Tulloch, Logie, we've just mentioned. And they seem to have been the key to the rehabilitation of the MacLeods of Raasay too in the eyes of the Crown. They seem to have secured them this deal in 1596 where they got a charter at the same time that the MacLeods of Lewis were being deprived of their lands. And in 1608, Mackenzie superiority, the MacLeods of Raasay accepted Mackenzie superiority over the lands of Raasay. And in 1610, this was followed up by, must have been Gille-Chaluim Garbh's son, when he was granted a charter from Mackenzie of Kintail. And one of the conditions was that the Raasay chief attended Mackenzie of Kintail whenever he wanted, and his lieutenants, when they shall happen to repair to the eels within birling of 12 oars, and likewise answering in whatsoever the said superior directs in his richt affairs within the Isles. This is a similar clause that Mackenzie imposes on another vassal, MacDonald of Clanranald, in the 1620s, obliging Clanranald to turn up whenever Mackenzie would summon him really to impose order. And I suppose a late reflection of this close relationship between the MacLeods of Gairloch, the MacLeods of Raasay and the Mackenzies of Kintail was when Mackenzies of Kintail and Seaforth's agent in Lewis, the Chamberlain Lewis for the Seaforths, Alistair Mackenzie of Phailte, composed a poem praising Fir Ishigal, or the leading men of the Hebrides. And Gille-Chaluim Garbh's son, Alistair, makes it into this sort of pantheon of the worthy. He's regarded as Slach and Yale, or the yardstick of generosity. And again, that generosity, harking back to the poem, which is one of the themes that we get from this, coming from perhaps their own self-image. Okay, so to conclude then, so I'd just conclude then by saying that the seems clear from the internal evidence of the poem that was produced by MacLeod of Raasay chief Gille-Chaluim Garbh. It dates to around 1575, and that it's really largely been overlooked in discussions on Gaelic poetry, although apart from Professor Watson and Professor Derek Thompson, who's also given it some consideration. There are several sources in Scots and English which give us a glimpse of the life and very troubled times of Sixteenth-Century. That's the MacLeods of Al Lewis, Ascent, Gaelic, Coigach and Raasay during Gille-Chaluim Garbh's lifetime. Much of the surviving source material concerns their struggle to navigate the troubled waters of the late 16th century Highlands and Islands. And most of these sources were generated by or those who had a vested interest in the expropriation of Sixteenth-Century and are less than sympathetic, it's fair to say. Given the level of reportage, mostly externally generated, which shines such a negative light on Sixteenth-Century, it would be easy to agree with the King and Council and most other contemporary sources and simply dismiss Gille-Chaluim Garbh as, and many of his neighbouring clansmen, as barbaric, and accept the case made by the state for its measures in the Highlands at face value. They talked in 1607, the state of extirpation, or wiping out the people in the Hebrides. And that never came to pass. But if you look at the tone taken by the statutes of Iona, it's very high-minded and sanctimonious. So you can, well, it's too easy to take all that at face value. This poem, on the other hand, gives us a glimpse of the Gaelic face of this kindred, how they presented themselves, how they saw themselves. Now, I don't want to sort of whitewash the Sixteenth-Century. They could be mad, bad, and dangerous to know. But this poem shows us another side of them, with a polished, generous, perhaps even civilized tribute by Gille-Chaluim Garbh of Raasay to three of his late contemporaries, with whom he'd clearly been on friendly terms. These chiefs had been esteemed in the Gaeltacht for their generosity, charity, and hospitality, qualities appreciated in Gaelic society, if not by their monarch. Thank you.
Great, well, thank you so much. I know it's for a fascinating lecture. It's really interesting to see how one poem, a Trí làmh phailte, can be used as a window into Hebridean history like this. So that's lovely. Many thanks. We do have time for questions, so I don't know if anybody would like to put questions in the chat, and then these can be relayed across to the speaker. But whilst you've got a minute or two to frame your question and type it in, I've got a couple I'd love to ask, so I'll start the ball rolling. I suppose I might start with almost the one that came to me at the end, really, is that obviously as you say, the rhetoric of the state is that these people are barbarous beyond words, and there's lots of turmoil. And obviously you've also demonstrated, yes, there was a lot of political turmoil, but in a way, how much do you see that turmoil being caused and perpetuated by the sort of machinations of the centralized state? I mean, are the bigger political changes having a knock-on effect to these areas and creating more instability?
Yes, I think that's definitely the case, and you've got to also think about the circumstance of James's reign. And like most of the stewards for the 16th century, he enjoyed a prolonged adult reign. There's the Ulster dimension, there's the British dimension. So this is a king in a hurry as well. In 1587, he really wants to stamp his authority on the Highlands, and so all of these things, and it is a pretty lawless place. For a long time, these clans had become pretty independent. They hadn't had any power imposed on them. So here now was a herring boom, and there's an economic factor to this, underpinning all of this sort of activity in the northwest. Here now is a herring boom. The biggest herring fleet at that time was from the East Neuk of Fife. So they're moving into Hebridean waters. Hebridean chiefs have a right to tax them, and the Fife fishermen aren't having any of it. So the Fife fishermen are well connected through the nobility to James VI as well. So all of these things are kind of interconnected. And as early as 1589, James had been planning to actually expropriate Lewis because it was a cash cow. I think that's one of the things, but there's definitely a need from James's point of view to impose order on the state. And although much ink's been spilled, and I've spilled a lot of ink on James's policies, I think it's there in a nutshell in Basilican Doron. There are two types of Gaels: those who'll do what I want, and those who won't do what I want. If they do what I want, fine. If they don't do what I want, I'm going to sort them out. And he tells us that. So he's pretty clear about it, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll save my second question because we've got some coming in now in the chat. The first one, I'll just read it out. Many thanks, Angus. Fascinating lecture with wonderful addition to plantation and civility. MacLeod of Raasay were aligned with Shiel Torkel, but Mackenzies of Kintail were bad news for Shiel Torkel in Lewis. Though MacLeod of Raasay was on terms with Mackenzie of Kintail, why did this not produce conflict between MacLeod of Raasay and the MacLeods of Lewis?
Because the MacLeods of, well, there might have been conflict between the MacLeods of Raasay and the MacLeods of Lewis. We see through a glass very darkly on the sort of internal politics of factionalism in the first decade of the 17th century. Certainly, James Spence of Wormiston, one of the lowland planters, actually, he actually goes on to become the James VI's ambassador to Sweden afterwards. A very shrewd guy. What he's trying to do is use the internal dissensions in Shiel Torkel, and he's trying to get one of the MacLeods from Assynt or Edrachurlish and try. He's luring carrots of land in front of him if he brings him back the head of Neil Orr, who's leader of the MacLeod of Lewis resistance. So there might have been, and probably there would have been actually, aggravation or friction between these various branches of MacLeods, but I don't think we have enough evidence to be able to say. I think is the answer to that.
Thank you. Yeah, we've got more questions coming in. So let's see now. Right. So would you say the othering of the Gaels was part of James VI's plan, allowing him to use the excuse of imposing civility for what was really a power grab?
Yes, I think that's part of it. If you're going to take people's land off them, and that's not unique to Lewis, it's a universal thing. I suppose you other them, you denigrate them. Lots of examples of that in Ireland too, where there's a dehumanization of people who are considered the barbarous. So I mean that's a part of it. I mean there's a wider dynamic across the later Middle Ages in Scotland. There's a growing sort of, it can be overplayed sometimes, but the Lowland Highland split. But yeah, I mean definitely there is othering going on. On the other hand, some of the people who succeeded the Fife Adventures in Lewis were Mackenzies, and the Mackenzies were adept at playing a lowland card and presenting themselves in a civilized manner, using English when they needed to, using Gaelic when they needed to as well. So yes and no, I think. If I mean by 1598, the MacLeods of Lewis had just given James so much aggravation that he wanted rid of them. There's no way he could countenance them, and people like the MacGregors the same. But I don't think we could say that. I don't think it would be fair to say that applies to all Gaels. So James was much more subtle than that, I think.
We've got a question from Rory about the effects of your research on the islands today, and I'm not going to try my Scottish Gaelic. So Rory, would you like to address the question yourself, please?
Well, thank you. Yes, so I'm very interested in the historical account, but I'm always asking myself, is there an application for these insights into life today in the Hebrides?
Well, ha féim ac in Eula tig sin na Sharvi ac in Kuchiachtri Hanning. So yes, to answer your question, I think so. I don't know if there's a direct application, but certainly you can read into this. I suppose all sorts of other narratives, but it's about. I suppose there's a, if you wanted to look for parallels with the present, local agency might be one, versus centralizing power. But yeah, I mean, but I think apart from the direct application, I think we could all do with knowing more about our history in the Highlands and Islands, because it's tended to be neglected, occluded, and I can't remember learning much about Highlands and Islands history in school. Very little, if anything, actually. So yes, that's kind of not answering what you were asking, but it's kind of dancing around it a little bit. But yeah, I think it's an interesting question.
Well, thank you.
Great. We do have time. There's another question. If not, we've certainly had some really interesting discussion there, and I hope it really inspires people to find out more about the history of the Highlands and Islands, as mentioned. I think quite often, I mean, I studied Scottish history at St Andrews. It was very much about the sort of the emergence of the Scottish monarchy, and hopefully things have changed now as time has gone past to be more inclusive of these other aspects of Scottish history. So really, we've just had one other comment just come in here now. So I'll just read that out, and that will be our last question that we'll take. So this is from Malcolm. It says that MacLeods of Essent accepted Mackenzie's superiority, which dated from 1588, leaving them in a difficult situation. There is perhaps a balance sheet to be drawn up in terms of the Mackenzie land grabbing of territories they left with clans and lands which they appropriated. Any comment you want to make there?
Yes, the late John Bannerman called the Mackenzies Earls of Ross in all but name. But my PhD thesis looked at the expansion of the Clan Mackenzie from very obscure beginnings in the 15th century. They had a meteoric rise during the 16th century, and you can actually chart the complaints of their neighbours in the Privy Council against the Mackenzies through the later 16th century. To little avail. The Mackenzies doubled their lands, and by the end of the 16th century, the chief of Clan Mackenzie is actually sitting on the Privy Council. And they're also furthering the power of the Crown in Ross and the Black Isle. So they rise to power as a steward service clan, and they later fall due to their connection with the stewards too. But yeah, they have a meteoric rise in the 16th century, and they more than double their lands. That's even before they take in Lewis. So it's a real period of dynamic expansion.
Brilliant. Okay, well, a great comment to end on, and thank you so much again, Aonghas, for a fascinating lecture. It was really enjoyable and lots to think about still.